The gunshot echoed across the dry plains of Shoshone City, Idaho, but Florence Vaughn didn't flinch. At 22, she'd grown accustomed to the sound of her father's rifle marking the beginning of each day, a warning to predators, both animal and human, that the Vaughn property was protected. What she couldn't grow accustomed to was the prison her father had built around her heart, a prison constructed from wealth, social standing, and expectations that stretched back 3 generations in Idaho territory. The year was 1876, and Florence stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Her fingers traced the letter hidden in her dress pocket, a farewell from Thomas Blackwell, the banker's son she had been courting for nearly a year. The man her father had handpicked as suitable, respectable, and most importantly, wealthy enough to continue the Vaughn legacy. "Florence," her mother's voice carried up the stairs, "your father wishes to speak with you before breakfast." "Coming, mother," Florence replied, knowing what awaited her downstairs. Another lecture about propriety, about her responsibilities as the only daughter of Harold Vaughn, the wealthiest cattle baron in Shoshone County. She descended the grand staircase of their 2-story home, the largest in Shoshone City, and found her father in his study examining ledgers with his reading glasses perched on his nose. At 55, Harold Vaughn's hair had gone completely gray, but his posture remained ramrod straight, a testament to his military background. "You wish to see me, father?" Florence stood in the doorway, her back straight, chin lifted. Harold looked up, removing his glasses. "Thomas Blackwell has asked for your hand in marriage." Florence felt her heart sink. "I see, you don't sound pleased." His voice was measured, careful. "I'm not," Florence said, summoning her courage. "I don't love him." Harold's expression hardened. "Love? What has love to do with marriage?" "Your mother and I had an arrangement, as did my parents before us. The Blackwells have connections that will secure our cattle business for the next generation." "I cannot marry a man I don't love," Florence insisted, her hands trembling slightly. Her father stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "This is about that drifter, isn't it? That Morgan fellow." Florence said nothing, but her silence was confirmation enough. "Alexander Morgan is nothing but a worthless saddle tramp with dirt under his fingernails and not a penny to his name." Harold's voice rose with each word. "I forbid you from seeing him again." "He's not a drifter," Florence countered. "He works harder than any man I've ever known. He's saved enough to buy land of his own. 100 acres of scrubland compared to our 1,000. He has nothing to offer you." "He offers me choice, father. He offers me respect." Harold slammed his fist on the desk. "Enough. You will marry Thomas Blackwell before summer's end, or what?" Florence challenged, her blue eyes flashing. "You'll force me, or you are no longer my daughter." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and final. Florence felt her mother's presence in the doorway behind her, heard her soft gasp. "Harold," her mother whispered. "I mean it, Margaret," Harold said, not taking his eyes off Florence. "Either she does her duty to this family or she is no longer part of it." Florence stood perfectly still, her world crumbling around her. "Then I am no longer your daughter," she said quietly. She turned and walked past her stunned mother, up the stairs to her bedroom, where she began to pack. 2 hours later, Florence stood at the stagecoach stop with a single trunk of belongings. Her mother had slipped her $50 and a locket containing a family portrait, a silent act of rebellion against Harold's proclamation. But she hadn't begged Florence to stay, hadn't fought against the banishment. That hurt almost as much as her father's words. As the coach approached, Florence felt a moment of panic. She had never been on her own. The world beyond Shoshone City was vast and unknown, but Alexander waited for her in Idaho Falls, where he'd gone to finalize the purchase of his land. He'd asked her to come with him, to marry him, to build a life together. She had said yes, but asked for time to tell her family properly. Now there was no family to tell. The stagecoach slowed to a stop, dust billowing around the wheels. The driver looked down at her. "Heading out, Miss Vaughn?" "Yes," she answered, chin high despite the tears threatening. "Idaho Falls." The driver nodded and helped her with her trunk. As Florence climbed aboard, she noticed several passengers already seated inside. A woman with a sleeping child, an elderly gentleman, and a young man in cowboy attire who tipped his hat politely as she entered. The journey began in silence. Florence watched Shoshone City shrink in the distance, her family home disappearing behind the hills. She had not said goodbye to her father. His final words, "No longer my daughter," rang in her ears. "First time traveling alone, miss." The cowboy's voice broke through her thoughts. He was perhaps 25, with kind eyes and sun-weathered skin. "Is it that obvious?" Florence asked. He smiled. "You keep looking back. Most folks heading somewhere new tend to look forward." "I suppose I'm doing both," she admitted. "Ethan Archer," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Florence Vaughn," she replied, shaking it briefly. "The Vaughn of Vaughn Cattle Company." His eyebrows raised slightly. Florence hesitated. Was she still a Vaughn? "Yes," she finally answered, "though perhaps not for much longer." Ethan nodded, not pressing for details. The stagecoach hit a rut in the road, jolting them all. The child woke briefly before being lulled back to sleep by his mother's gentle rocking. "You're heading to Idaho Falls?" Ethan asked after a while. "Yes, I'm meeting someone there." "Your husband?" "No," Florence said. "Not yet, anyway." Ethan nodded again, understanding in his eyes. "Well, Idaho Falls is a fine place for new beginnings." The journey continued through the day, the landscape changing from the familiar valleys of Shoshone County to the wider plains that stretched toward the Snake River. Florence found herself relaxing slightly in Ethan's company. He spoke of cattle drives and adventures in Montana territory, of wild horses and the changing seasons on the range. "You seem to know the territory well," Florence observed. "Been riding it since I was 16, Ethan confirmed. "Started as a ranch hand up in Montana, worked my way south. Now I manage the Circle S Ranch outside Idaho Falls." "That's impressive for someone so young," Ethan shrugged modestly. "Just fortunate to have good teachers, and I love the land." As the afternoon stretched on, the stagecoach made a stop at a small way station. The passengers disembarked to stretch their legs and take a meal. Florence, unused to such modest accommodations, hesitated in the doorway of the station. "It's not fancy," Ethan said behind her, "but me makes the best stew between Shoshone and Idaho Falls." The meal was indeed better than Florence expected, rich with venison and wild onions. She ate cautiously at first, then with genuine appetite. The elderly gentleman regaled them with stories of the gold rush days, while the mother spoke quietly of her husband waiting in boys. Florence remained silent about her own circumstances, but found herself studying Ethan when he wasn't looking. There was something reassuring about his present steadiness without her father's rigidity, strength without intimidation. As they prepared to board the coach again, the station master approached. "Got word of trouble ahead," he told the driver. "Group of road agents hit a coach yesterday near the Snake River crossing." A ripple of concern went through the passengers. Road agents, a polite term for bandits, were a known hazard on the frontier. "We'll take the northern route," the driver decided. "Adds half a day, but safer." Florence felt a flutter of anxiety. Alexander expected her tomorrow. Would he worry if she was delayed? "Don't fret," Ethan said softly, noticing her expression. "We'll get there safely, just a bit later than planned." The detour took them through rougher country, and by nightfall they had reached a small settlement consisting of little more than a stable, an inn, and a few scattered buildings. The driver announced they would stop for the night. The inn had only 3 rooms available. The mother and child took one, the elderly gentleman another, leaving Florence and Ethan to negotiate the third. "I'll sleep in the stable," Ethan offered immediately. "That's unnecessary," Florence said, surprising herself. "The room likely has 2 beds, and I trust you as a gentleman." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "You have my word." The room indeed had 2 narrow beds on opposite walls. Florence sat on one, suddenly exhausted by the day's events. Her new reality was sinking in Disowned, traveling to a man her parents had never approved of with only $50 and a trunk of belongings to her name. "May I ask what takes you to Idaho Falls?" Ethan inquired, sitting on his bed and removing his boots. Florence hesitated, then decided truth was simpler than evasion. "I'm going to marry a man my father doesn't approve of. Alexander Morgan. He's purchased land near Idaho Falls." "Morgan," Ethan repeated thoughtfully. "Don't believe I know him. He came to Shoshone City about a year ago, worked as a ranch hand for the Petersons. We met at the Founders' Day dance." Florence smiled at the memory. "He's different from the men my father usually approved of. Ambitious, hardworking, but without family connections or inheritance." "And you love him," Ethan stated, not a question. "Yes," Florence said, though something in her voice wavered. Ethan caught it. But Florence looked down at her hands. "It's happening so fast. This morning I was Florence Vaughn of Vaughn Cattle Company. Tonight I don't know what I am." "You're still Florence," Ethan said gently. "The rest is just circumstance." She looked up at him, surprised by the simple wisdom. "I suppose you're right. Get some rest," he suggested. "Tomorrow's another long day." Florence lay awake long after Ethan's breathing had deepened into sleep. She thought of Alexander, his charming smile, his grand plans for their future. He'd swept into her life like a whirlwind, offering escape from her father's suffocating expectations. But now, with that escape accomplished, she felt strangely hollow. Morning arrived with heavy clouds and the promise of rain. The stagecoach departed early, the passengers subdued by the weather. Florence found herself sitting beside Ethan, their conversation picking up naturally from the previous day. "Tell me about your ranch," she asked. "Not my ranch," Ethan corrected. "I manage it for Samuel Simmons. He's getting on in years, hands too twisted with arthritis to do much riding anymore." "But you run things?" "Day to day, yes. 80 head of cattle, 20 horses, and enough work to keep 10 men busy from sunup to sundown." "You enjoy it," Florence observed. Ethan smiled. "Can't imagine doing anything else." "There's nothing like watching the sunrise over open country that you've helped nurture and protect." The coach jolted suddenly, then lurched sideways. Florence was thrown against Ethan as the vehicle tilted precariously. There were shouts from outside, the horses whinnying in panic. Then the coach crashed onto its side. For a moment, everything was confusion and darkness. Florence felt Ethan's arms around her, shielding her as they tumbled. Then stillness, broken only by groans and the creak of damaged wood. "Is everyone all right?" the driver called from outside. Ethan helped Florence sit up. "We're okay in here," he called back, then looked at the other passengers. The elderly gentleman had a cut on his forehead and the mother was clutching her child protectively, but everyone was conscious. They climbed out through the door that now faced upward. The stagecoach's rear axle had broken, leaving the vehicle tilted in a roadside ditch. Rain was beginning to fall, light but steady. "Can it be fixed?" Florence asked the driver. He shook his head. "Not here. We're about 15 miles from the next station. I'll need to ride ahead for help." 15 miles in the rain, with a woman and child, an elderly man, and limited supplies. Florence saw the concern in Ethan's eyes as he surveyed their situation. "There's a line shack about 3 miles east of here," Ethan said. "Used it once during a cattle drive. Basic shelter, might have some supplies." "Better than standing in the rain," the driver agreed. They salvaged what they could from the coach. Florence's trunk was too heavy to carry far, so she took only what would fit in a small carpet bag. The driver departed with one of the horses, promising to return with help by the following day. Ethan led their small group eastward. The rain intensified, turning the trail muddy and treacherous. Florence's city boots were soon soaked through, her dress hem heavy with mud. When the child began to tire, Ethan carried him on his shoulders, telling stories to keep his spirits up. The line shack appeared as the rain became a downpour, a simple one-room structure with a stone chimney and a lean-to for firewood. Inside was sparse but dry. A small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a fireplace. Ethan immediately set to building a fire while Florence helped the mother, whose name was Sarah, settle the child. The elderly gentleman, Mr. Harrison, sat heavily in one of the chairs. Clearly exhausted by the trek, by nightfall they had created a semblance of comfort. The fire burned steadily, their wet clothes hung on improvised lines to dry, and Ethan had found some preserved foods in a cabinet: jerky, beans, and coffee. "You've done this before," Florence observed as Ethan prepared a simple meal over the fire. "Part of ranch life," he replied. "You learn to make do." Florence watched him work, admiring his quiet efficiency. Alexander was charismatic and full of grand visions, but she tried to imagine him in this situation handling a crisis with calm capability, and the image wouldn't form. They ate together, the small group bonding over their shared predicament. Mr. Harrison entertained them with stories from his youth during the Mexican-American War. Sarah's child, Michael, fell asleep in his mother's lap. "We should all rest," Ethan suggested when the meal was finished. "The bed for Sarah and Michael. Mr. Harrison can take the bedroll I found. Florence, you can use my coat for padding near the fire." "And you?" Florence asked. "I'll keep watch by the door. We're in wild country." After some negotiation, they settled in for the night. Florence lay near the fire, Ethan's coat beneath her, listening to the rain on the roof and the occasional crack of the fire. Across the room, Ethan sat by the door, his profile outlined against the dim light. "You should rest too," Florence whispered. He glanced over. "I will in a while." Florence studied him. "Why are you doing all this, taking care of us?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "My pa taught me that a man's character is shown by how he treats others when there's nothing to gain from it. Your father sounds like a wise man." "Was," Ethan corrected softly. "Lost him in '68, cattle drive gone wrong, stampede during a storm." "I'm sorry," Florence said. Then, after a pause, "My father disowned me yesterday morning." Ethan turned to face her more fully. "Because of Morgan," Florence nodded. "He said I had to choose my family or Alexander." "That's a harsh choice to force on someone you love." "He doesn't see it as love, just duty, family name, business connections." Ethan considered this. "And Morgan, what does he see?" Florence hesitated. It was a question she hadn't fully allowed herself to contemplate. "He sees possibility, I think, a partner for his ambitions." "Not you specifically, just a partner." The question struck Florence like a physical blow. I don't know," Ethan nodded, not pressing further. "Try to sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day one way or another." Florence closed her eyes, but sleep was elusive. Ethan's question echoed in her mind. Did Alexander love her for herself, or for what she represented: a connection to wealth, to status, to the society he aspired to join? He'd been so insistent that they could make a life together, away from her father's influence. But had he ever really known her, beyond the privileged daughter of Harold Vaughn, and what did she know of him, really? His dreams, yes, his ambitions, but his character. Would he have carried a child for miles in the rain, or given up his coat without complaint, or known how to create comfort from almost nothing? Morning arrived with clearing skies. The driver hadn't returned, so after a simple breakfast, Ethan suggested they continue toward the station rather than wait. "We can move at Mr. Harrison's pace," he said. "Even if help is coming, we'll meet them sooner that way." They set out, the ground still muddy but the air fresh after the rain. Florence found herself walking beside Ethan, their conversation flowing easily despite her troubled thoughts. "Tell me about Alexander," Ethan said after a while. Florence was surprised by the direct question. "He's charming. Full of plans and dreams. He wants to build something of his own, not inherit it like the sons of established ranchers." "Admirable," Ethan said. "What else?" "He's well-read, quotes poetry sometimes, he dances beautifully." Florence smiled at the memory of their first dance, but then frowned. "But I realize I don't know how he'd handle a day like yesterday, or what he thinks about things that matter to me, like how to treat people who work for you, or whether wealth obligates generosity." "Important things to know about a life partner," Ethan observed. "Yes," Florence agreed softly. "Important things." They walked in silence for a time, Florence lost in thought. She had been so focused on escaping her father's control that she hadn't fully considered what or who she was escaping to. Around midday, they spotted riders approaching the stagecoach driver with 3 men from the station and a wagon. The relief was palpable among their small group. The journey to Idaho Falls resumed with Florence riding in the wagon alongside Sarah, Michael, and Mr. Harrison. Ethan rode one of the horses, sometimes ranging ahead, sometimes dropping back to ride alongside the wagon. Each time he returned to Florence's side, she felt a strange mix of comfort and confusion. They reached Idaho Falls by sunset the next day. The town was larger than Shoshone City, busier with the commerce of the railroad that had reached it 2 years prior. As they pulled into the station, Florence scanned the crowd, expecting to see Alexander waiting. He wasn't there. "Your fiancé was expecting you yesterday," the station master explained when she inquired. "He waited most of the day, then said he had business at his property. Left word for you to take a room at the Grand Hotel and he'd come for you tomorrow." Florence felt a flicker of disappointment. Certainly, Alexander couldn't have known about the accident, but still. "I can escort you to the hotel," Ethan offered, having overheard the exchange. "Thank you," Florence said, realizing she was reluctant to part with him. They said goodbye to their traveling companions. Mr. Harrison was continuing to Boise the next day, while Sarah and Michael were meeting her husband. Promises were made to visit if ever they passed through each other's towns again, the kind of promises travelers often make, but rarely keep. The Grand Hotel was indeed grand by frontier standards, 3 stories with a proper restaurant and a small lobby furnished with velvet chairs. Alexander had arranged a room for Florence, paid in advance. "Well," Ethan said as they stood in the lobby, "I suppose this is where we part ways." Florence felt suddenly bereft. "Where will you go?" "Back to the Circle S. Got responsibilities waiting." "Of course." Florence extended her hand. "Thank you for everything, Ethan. I don't know how we would have managed without you." Ethan took her hand, holding it a moment longer than strictly necessary. "It was my pleasure, Miss Vaughn." As he turned to leave, Florence found herself calling after him. "Will you be in town tomorrow?" He looked back, surprise evident in his expression. "Hadn't planned on it. Why?" Florence hesitated. "I'd like you to meet Alexander, and I'd like him to meet you." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or resignation. "If you think that's wise." "Noon, here at the hotel," Ethan nodded once. "Noon it is." After he left, Florence went to her room, her emotions in turmoil. The hotel had provided a bath, and she soaked gratefully, washing away the dirt of travel. Her few remaining clean clothes were simple, nothing like the finery she'd left behind in Shoshone City, but she dressed carefully nonetheless. In the hotel restaurant, she ate alone, acutely aware of her solitude. A week ago, she would have been dining with her parents, surrounded by the comfort of the familiar. Now she was adrift, waiting for a man who hadn't waited for her. Morning came with sunshine streaming through her window. Florence dressed in her best remaining outfit, a blue dress that brought out her eyes. She spent the morning writing in her journal, trying to make sense of the tumultuous feelings of the past days. At 11:30, there was a knock at her door. Expecting a hotel employee, Florence opened it to find Alexander standing there, hat in hand, his smile as charming as she remembered. "Florence, my darling," he embraced her, kissing her cheek. "I was so worried when you didn't arrive as planned." "The stagecoach had an accident," she explained, stepping back slightly. "We were delayed." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "The other passengers and I, one of them, Ethan Archer, helped us find shelter and led us to safety." Alexander nodded, apparently uninterested in the details. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. I've secured the property, 120 acres with a small house already built. We can be married next week, once the banns are read." His certainty, once thrilling, now felt presumptuous. "Alexander, I've only just arrived. And my circumstances have changed significantly. My father has disowned me." Alexander's expression shifted, his smile faltering. Disowned completely. Yes, I have what I brought with me and nothing more, I see. Alexander moved to the window, his back to her. That complicates things. Florence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Complicates how? The property purchase. I was counting on a certain contribution from your family to complete the payments. You expected my father to give us money after he made it clear he disapproved of you. Alexander turned, his charm returning like a mask being replaced. I thought perhaps once we were married he would relent. Fathers often do for their daughter's happiness. Not my father, Florence said coldly, and you never mentioned needing my family's money before. It wasn't a need, precisely, more an expectation. After all, you were a Vaughn. Florence stared at him, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. You courted me for my name, for my father's money. Now, Florence, did you ever love me at all, or was I just a means to your ambitions? Alexander's face hardened. Don't be dramatic. Of course I care for you, but marriage is as much a business arrangement as a romantic one. Surely you understand that, coming from your background. Florence laughed bitterly. That's exactly what my father said. The two of you have more in common than you realize. A knock at the door interrupted them. Florence opened it to find Ethan standing there, his hat in hand, dressed in clean clothes though still unmistakably a working cowboy. Miss Vaughn, he greeted her formally, then noticed Alexander. Pardon me, I didn't realize you had company. Not at all, Florence said, motioning him inside. Ethan, this is Alexander Morgan. Alexander, this is Ethan Archer, the man I told you about. The two men sized each other up, an unspoken tension filling the room. Mr. Archer, Alexander said coolly. I understand you assisted Florence during her journey. Just did what anyone would, Ethan replied modestly. Well, your assistance is no longer required. Florence and I will be married next week. Florence felt a flash of anger. That's not been decided, Alexander. Of course it has. It's why you came to Idaho Falls. I came because I thought I loved you, Florence said quietly. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Thought? I'm not sure I know you at all, Florence admitted. The man who met me today seems more concerned with my father's money than with me. Alexander's face flushed. This is absurd. We've had plans for months. Plans you made that I agreed to without fully understanding what I was agreeing to, Florence countered. I won't be rushed into marriage, Alexander, not anymore. Is this about him? Alexander jerked his head toward Ethan. This is about me, Florence said firmly. About what I want, not what my father wants or what you want. Alexander's charm disappeared entirely. You've changed, Florence. The woman I courted in Shoshone City would never speak this way. Perhaps I have changed, Florence acknowledged, or perhaps this is who I've always been when not under my father's thumb. The three of them stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Alexander reached for his hat. I see I've wasted my time, he said coldly. Both in Shoshone City and in purchasing land I can't fully pay for without your family's support. Good day, Florence. He left without another word, the door closing firmly behind him. Florence stared at the door, waiting for the pain of loss to hit her. Instead, she felt oddly liberated. I'm sorry, Ethan said softly. That wasn't my place to witness. Florence turned to him, really seeing him his honest eyes, the quiet strength in his bearing. Actually, I think it was exactly your place. Florence, you asked me yesterday what Alexander sees when he looks at me, she interrupted. Now I know. He saw a means to an end, a way to acquire wealth and status. Ethan took a step closer. And what do you see when you look at him? Florence considered the question seriously. A reflection of my father's world dressed in different clothes, the same values, the same priorities, just packaged differently. And what do you want now? I don't know exactly, Florence admitted. But I know I want to discover who I am outside my father's house. I want to make my own choices, even if they're mistakes. That sounds like a fine beginning, Ethan said, a small smile playing at his lips. Florence looked at him curiously. Yesterday, when I asked if you thought I should marry Alexander, you said something I've been thinking about ever since. What was that? you said. If you loved him without doubt, you wouldn't be asking me. Ethan nodded, remembering. It's true. There's something else true, Florence said, taking a deep breath. When my father disowned me for loving the wrong man, I was devastated, but now I'm grateful because it led me here, to this moment. Ethan took another step closer. Florence, I don't have much to offer. Just a manager's position at the Circle S, a small cabin, and hard work every day. You have more to offer than you realize, Florence countered. Kindness, integrity, the ability to see me, not just what I represent. I do see you, Ethan said softly. I've seen you since the moment you climbed into that stagecoach, looking back at what you were leaving behind. And now I'm looking forward, Florence said, reaching for his hand. Not rushing, not making the same mistake twice, but I'd like to get to know you, Ethan Archer. The real you, not just the man who rescued us in a crisis. Ethan's fingers closed around hers. I'd like that very much. I have no family now, Florence said, the reality of it still sharp. No certainty about the future. Then perhaps it's time to find a new family, Ethan suggested. One you choose for yourself, and as for the future, he smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. When your family disowned you for loving the wrong man, perhaps it was so you could find the right one. Florence felt tears well in her eyes, but they were different from the tears she'd shed leaving Shoshone City. These were tears of possibility, of hope. I think you might be right, she whispered. Outside the window, Idaho Falls bustled with the energy of a growing frontier town. Within the room, two people stood at the beginning of something neither had expected, a love born not from family expectations or social climbing, but from shared hardship, mutual respect, and the recognition of something genuine in each other's character. It wasn't the future Florence had imagined when she boarded the stagecoach in Shoshone City. It was, perhaps, something better, a future she would build herself with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. 7 years later, Florence stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching Ethan teach their 5-year-old son to ride a pony in the yard. Their 3-year-old daughter clung to Florence's skirts, clapping with delight at her brother's accomplishment. The Circle S was theirs now. Samuel Simmons had sold it to them 3 years ago, accepting payments over time when he saw how Ethan had improved the operation. They had 60 acres of good grazing land, a herd of prime cattle, and a reputation for fair dealing throughout the territory. A letter had arrived that morning from her mother, breaking 7 years of silence. Harold Vaughn had passed away, leaving the Vaughn Cattle Company in disarray. Margaret Vaughn was asking for Florence's forgiveness and for Ethan's help in sorting out the business affairs. Florence would answer tomorrow with an invitation to visit, to meet her grandchildren, to begin healing the breach that had seemed so final that morning in Shoshone City. She smiled as Ethan lifted their son from the pony, praising his efforts. He caught her eye across the yard and winked, the same warmth in his gaze that had sustained her through difficult first years, through childbirth, through building a life from almost nothing. Her father had disowned her for loving the wrong man. But in doing so, he had unknowingly given her the greatest gift, the freedom to love the right one.